It's April 1865, and the United States of America has only recently emerged from an era where it was anything other than united. A mere month prior, the country had been divided into two factions, the Union in the north and the Confederate States of America in the south, who, for approximately 4 years, 1 month, and 2 weeks, had beaten each other bloody in fierce battles that ranged across the length and breadth of the territorial United States. It was a war where father fought son and brother killed brother, many doing so at first in the name of national preservation versus states' rights, and eventually in the name of human property versus an inalienable sense of humanity and human rights. Now, however, the war was over. More than 620,000 Americans lay dead, and 6 enslaved persons had been made free for every single fallen soldier. The Confederacy was gone. The Union had prevailed, and all that remained was to restore a nation that had, for the better part of 4 years, been tearing itself apart. This included a national reconciliation, reconstruction efforts, and, quite importantly, the release of prisoners. At this point in time, there were thousands of Union troops still in the South who had been prisoners of war, surviving in military prisons such as the infamously brutal Andersonville POW camp in Georgia and the Cahaba facility in Alabama. Many of these prisoners, though freed, were malnourished and emaciated as a result of enduring horrible living conditions for months or even years on end. Even so, many of them were grateful, as they had at least survived to be repatriated when so many of their comrades had died of disease and mistreatment. Most of the surviving POWs in this story were returning to their home states, such as Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Kentucky. They were to travel the Mississippi River to the Cumberland River. With the Union-held fortress of Vicksburg, the Mississippi had become the western center for prisoner exchanges. Thousands of captive Union soldiers had been moved to a holding area known as Camp Fisk, about 4 miles east of Vicksburg. There, they waited to be exchanged for an equal number of Confederate soldiers. By April, however, it was clear that the system was breaking down. More Union soldiers were accumulating at Camp Fisk than could be swapped for rebels on a one-for-one basis. Eventually, the Confederates began releasing Union prisoners regardless of if there was a fellow Confederate to receive in exchange. Built in the 1860s by the John Litherbury Boatyard in Cincinnati, Ohio, the Sultana was meant for use in the cotton trade along the waters of the lower Mississippi. Launched on January 3, 1863, she measured 260 feet or 79 meters long, 42 feet or 13 meters wide, with a weight of 1,719 short tons or 1,559 tons. She had 2 side-mounted paddle wheels driven by 4 tubular or fire tube boilers. Each fire tube boiler was 18 feet long and 46 inches in diameter and contained 24 5-inch flues, tubes that ran from the firebox to the chimney. Steamboats like the Sultana normally came with a crew of 85 and with a designed capacity of 376 passengers. Her first 2 years saw her steaming between St. Louis and New Orleans, during which she saw regular use as a troop transport during the Civil War. Her captain, James Cass Mason, was generally respected by his peers, but also considered to be reckless. He had already had 1 boat confiscated from him for carrying Confederate contraband and was in serious financial straits by the end of the war. On April 13, 1865, he led the Sultana from St. Louis, heading for New Orleans. The steamboat had arrived at Cairo, Illinois on the morning of April 15th, when her crew learned of the fateful news of what had happened the night prior at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Upon hearing of President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, the captain took some newspapers and headed south to spread the story. Upon reaching Vicksburg, Mississippi, Mason was approached by Captain Reuben Hatch, the chief quartermaster at Vicksburg, who made him a proposal. The U.S. government was willing to pay $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer to any steamboat captain who would take a group of Union POWs back north. With no real controls over safety or comfort issues, many river merchants knew they would be able to pack the former prisoners aboard without any worries for peacetime load limits, a situation bound to lead to corruption. Knowing that Mason needed money, Hatch suggested that he could guarantee the captain of the steamer a full load of 1,000 prisoners so long as he agreed to give him a kickback. Mason agreed to Hatch's offer, hoping to make a significant amount of money from the deal. However, there was one small hole in their plans. Literally. When the Sultana had docked in Vicksburg at 6 p.m. on April 22nd, she arrived with an issue of her own. One of her boilers was leaking as a result of suffering from a ruptured seam or crack in the boiler plate, which forced the onboard engineer to lower the pressure in the system. This in turn significantly slowed the boat's speed. As the crack needed to be patched, a local mechanic was brought in. Although the mechanic wanted to cut out and replace the seam, Mason knew such a job would take a few days, likely costing him his shipment of prisoners who would have consequently been sent home on other boats. Mason and his chief engineer convinced the mechanic to make temporary repairs. He hammered back the bulged boiler plate and riveted a patch over the seam that was less thick than what would be required to properly address the damage. Ultimately, the temporary repair took 1 day instead of several. All the while, Sultana moved to take on her payload of prisoners. The released federal prisoners were moved from Camp Fisk to Vicksburg by train. Although Hatch suggested that Mason might get as many as 1,000 released Union prisoners, a mix-up with the parole camp books and suspicion of bribery from other steamboat captains caused the Union officer in charge of the loading, Captain George Augustus Williams, to place every man at the parole camp on board Sultana, believing the number to be less than 1,500. The men were packed into every available space, as all the cabin spaces were already filled with civilian passengers. There was so much overflow that, in some places, the decks began to creak and sag and had to be supported with heavy wooden beams. Of the men who flooded aboard the Sultana, the first among them to reach the boat could hear banging coming from below as repairs were completed on the cracked boiler. A private named William Bohr convinced his friends to find a spot away from said boiler, warning that if it did explode, they would go higher than a kite. Open space disappeared as the various decks filled with POWs, and still more men came, leading Ohio Sergeant William Fies to mutter that they were being loaded more like so many cattle than men. A corporal, Erastus Winters, compared their experience to something like a flock of sheep or a drove of hogs. It was just after 9 p.m. on April 24th when the Sultana departed from Vicksburg with between 1,800 and 2,222 passengers on board. This included over 100 paying passengers, men, women, and children, the crew of 85, as well as 22 guards from the 58th Ohio Infantry Regiment. Here it should be noted that the boat's life-saving equipment, as well as onboard amenities, were scaled to deal with a max capacity of 300 deck passengers. Severely overcrowded and under-equipped for the job at hand, many aboard the boat still left Vicksburg with high spirits. Despite having survived some of the worst conditions imaginable and still suffering from the effects of their treatment, the Union soldiers aboard were willing to endure what was arguably a less arduous challenge in the last months and years of their lives. For them, the war was over, as well as their long imprisonment. They were going home. Sultana spent 2 days traveling upriver, fighting against one of the worst spring floods in the Mississippi's history. Trees along the riverbank were almost completely covered until only the very tops of their canopies were still visible above the water. On April 26th, 30 hours after departing from Vicksburg, the Sultana stopped at the city of Helena, Arkansas, where local photographer Thomas W. Banks took a picture of the vessel. In it, he captured the many soldiers atop her overcrowded decks, awaiting their journey's end. Things momentarily seemed on the brink of disaster when so many soldiers swarmed to one side to wave at the cameraman that the steamboat almost capsized. Later, between 6:30 to 7 p.m., Sultana arrived for a scheduled stop at Memphis, Tennessee, where the crew began unloading supplies of sugar and wine from her hold. At this point, a few customers also came off the boat. While she was there, several officers from a nearby U.S. gunboat came aboard for a visit. One of them noted that some of the men on board the Sultana were too weak to walk without being supported by more fortunate comrades. Others were compelled by sheer weakness to lie on the cots or blankets spread upon the decks. Near midnight, Sultana departed from Memphis, leaving behind about 200 men. She then went a short distance upriver to take on 1,000 bushels of coal from some coal barges at Hopefield, Arkansas. At this time, Captain Mason, who had grown increasingly anxious over the safety of the Sultana and her passengers, told one prisoner that he would give all the interest he had in the boat if it was safely landed in Cairo. Then, at about 1 a.m., Sultana started north once again. 1 hour later, at 2 a.m., on April 27, 1865, the Sultana was 7 or 8 miles north of Memphis, where the river was nearly 4 miles wide. Most of the POW passengers were asleep on the crowded decks. All the while, stokers shoveled coal to feed her 4 massive boilers. Around her, she was easing past a collection of several small islands. Without warning, a massive explosion erupted from below. One of the ship's boilers detonated, quickly followed by 2 more. The resulting sound was heard 7 miles away in Memphis. A witness on the nearby shore described it as the thundering noise of 100 earthquakes. The blast tore a 45-degree hole from the boat's innards all the way to her stern, bursting through the decks directly above the boilers, spewing white-hot coals, burning cordwood, and splintered timber into the night sky like fireworks. Shards of shattered boilers ripped through passengers like shrapnel. Hundreds of her passengers, most of them Union POWs who had already survived so much, were killed instantly. Scalding water and clouds of steam covered those initial survivors who lay sleeping near the boilers. The forward part of the upper deck, already sagging under the weight of her passengers, collapsed onto the middle deck. Many unfortunate souls, or perhaps more fortunate, were crushed. Those who were far more unlucky were trapped in the resulting wreckage, where they could only await their slow, agonizing demise as fires quickly spread throughout the hull, burning them to death. Many more were hurled into the cold waters of the Mississippi, which was already high with floodwater. One Michigan soldier recalled, "The first thing that I knew or heard was a terrible crash. Everything seemed to be falling." A Kentuckian, Simeon Shelf, said, "A piece of iron glanced my head, and in the excitement, I thought the rebels had fired a battery on us." An Ohioan said, "Not more than 3 feet from where I was lying was a hole clear through the boat. It seemed as if the explosion of the boilers had torn everything out from top to bottom. Everywhere, steam was escaping. Women were screaming, soldiers and crew cursing and swearing, horses neighing, mules braying, splinters flying," reported another Ohio man, Nicholas Carnes. "I saw many men mangled," added Peter Roselot, "some with arms and legs broken, others scalded and screaming in their agony." A Tennessee soldier recollected, "I saw men, while attempting to escape, pitch down through the hatchway that was full of blue curling flames, or rush wildly from the vessel to death and destruction in the turbid waters below." Most of the Sultana's pilot house was gone, having been obliterated by the explosion. The smokestacks shuddered and then toppled. The starboard smokestack fell backward into the 30-foot wide hole blasted into the steamer. The port smokestack fell forward onto the crowded forward section of the upper deck, hitting the steamboat's bell as it fell. Fortunately, the sturdy railings around the 2 openings of the main stairway prevented the upper deck from crushing down completely onto the middle deck. The men located around the 2 openings quickly crawled under the wreckage and down the main stairs. Further back, the collapsing decks formed a slope that led down into the exposed furnace boxes. The broken wood caught fire and turned the remaining superstructure into a raging inferno. Survivors panicked and raced for the safety of the water. Already weak from their imprisonment, however, many eventually ran out of strength and began to cling to one another. Whole groups went down together. The entire midsection was awash with flames being blown sternward by the wind. Within 20 minutes, nearly the whole of the Sultana was in flames. As the steamboat burned, and with few life preservers or lifeboats available, most of those who survived the blast were forced to jump into the wide, flood-swollen waters of the Mississippi. The river current scattered the survivors along both sides of the Mississippi and carried many downstream. Some managed to swim to shore. Others held on to bits of flotsam until they reached dry land or caught a hold of semi-submerged trees, allowing them to find refuge in their branches. As Ohioan J.S. Cook stated, the choice was between drowning and burning to death. All was confusion, attested an Ohio man, William H. Norton, attesting that from the lower deck he could see that men were jumping into the river by the hundreds. "I saw at least 20 drown at once," said Indiana cavalryman Stephen M. Gaston. As fast as one would feel he was drowning, he would clutch at the nearest. and I believe many a bold swimmer was drowned that night who could have saved himself if alone. Once the fittings burned loose, the side paddle wheels broke away, causing the Sultana to pivot around 180 degrees. The fires reversed course and burned toward the bow, where perhaps as many as 500 people were huddled. Within minutes, all were either burned to death or cast into the water. Tennessean Andrew Perry, while trying his best to cling to the boat, watched with astonishment as a man and a mule battled one another for a floating piece of the wheelhouse. The mule would get its front feet on the raft, and the man would knock it off with a club. It would come again. For several times the mule almost capsized the craft. I don't think I ever saw a more earnest fight. The mule finally gave up, or was killed. Without a pilot to steer the boat, Sultana became a burning hulk that drifted slowly downriver as those on board who, by some miracle, were still alive, struggled to survive.